Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kimball Art Museum. I'm George Shackelford, Deputy Director, and thank you for coming out this evening to hear one of 3 talks that we've scheduled for the next several months about Murillo from Heaven to Earth, our special exhibition in the galleries upstairs. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Teresi, an art historian who's based in Dallas. Her field of concentration is the art of Spain and its influence in the world in the early modern era. She's held fellowships at the Baltimore Museum of Art, the British Museum, and the Meadows Museum at SMU, and she has taught both at Johns Hopkins and at UT Dallas. In the last year, Rebecca completed her PhD with a dissertation on the images of the Immaculate Conception and how they were used strategically by the Church in Spain and its dominions. She's taking that research a step further with the book she's now writing, which deals with the images of the Immaculate Conception made in Spanish territories at the time when the concept of the Immaculate Conception, that is, was still the subject of much debate. But for tonight, she'll be talking mostly about Murillo as a religious painter, one who made something of a specialty of paintings of the Virgin in glory, symbolizing her status as free of all sin, immaculate. The title of her talk is Murillo's Heaven, Art and Devotion in Baroque Seville. So please welcome Rebecca Teresi.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here, and especially thank you to George for that kind introduction and to Nancy Edwards for the invitation to be here with you this evening. First of all, can everyone hear me well? Yes, good. And I'm just checking I've got my special pointer, which is very important. So just like George said, today we will be exploring the career of one of the most fascinating and yet at times critically underappreciated artists of the 17th century. Being with you here tonight is unusually special to me, not only because Murillo is one of my very favorite artists, but also because clearly it's going to be my last hurrah for the year, as in a few days or weeks, who knows, I will have a little bit more in my mind than the 17th century. So for those of you who have had time to spend a few moments or more in the From Heaven to Earth exhibition, you'll know that it highlights Murillo's versatility as an artist, taking you from the romanticized streets of Baroque Seville through portraits of the city's mercantile and ecclesiastical elite to sparkling, large format renditions of biblical history. Seeing many of these paintings in person for the first time feels like meeting old friends, and I cannot tell you how lucky we are to have such an important selection of Murillo's works all in one place at one time here with us in Fort Worth. The Kimball exhibition joins other such landmark exhibitions on Murillo held in recent years, such as that organized by the Frick on his self-portraits, as well as the quadricentennial exhibitions in his native Seville, a reflection not only of the artist's prolific career, with over 420 works surviving in his catalog, but also of the unbridled enthusiasm for collecting works by Murillo both during his lifetime and especially in the 2 centuries after his death, reflected in the diasporic fate of his body of work. The avidity with which works by Murillo were collected, and in some cases looted, in the 17th through 19th centuries is perhaps a reflection of the universal appeal of his style, prized for his soft coloration and the gentle way in which he executed his works. And here I've brought a quintessential example of this, which is the Dulwich Virgin of the Rosary, with the serene and delicate Virgin gently holding the beautiful Christ child on a hazy gold ground, brilliantly executed, yet with a lingering whiff of something one might find on a chocolate box or cross-stitched on a cushion. This same sweetness of style for which Murillo was most prized during his lifetime and beyond is also perhaps to blame for the artist's underestimation in our own age. To offer you one example, in 2018, the New Yorker's reviewer memorably and not very flatteringly termed Murillo's manner as quote-unquote high fructose. Add this to the long shadow cast by Seville's most famous son, who I know you all know very well at the Kimball, Diego Velázquez, who was Murillo's senior by 18 years, and it is easy to see why Murillo is not always given his due. All this notwithstanding, Murillo is an artist not to be dismissed or devalued. Indeed, in the centuries following his death, he was considered to be a painter on par with the likes of Titian and Van Dyck. Whatever you make of his style, there is no doubt that Murillo was a thinking artist who engaged with the intellectual, theological, and sociocultural debates of his age and took his practice and legacy extremely seriously. And as just one example of this, he eventually co-founded the first formal artistic academy in the Iberian Peninsula. He grappled with the same representational challenges that other greats of Spanish Baroque art did, and indeed, he was the only artist of the Spanish Golden Age, apart from Ribera, to achieve a truly international reputation during his lifetime. While it is true that the Kimball exhibition brings to the fore Murillo's secular works, it also shows us that the secular and the sacred were absolutely intertwined in Baroque Seville, and that Murillo himself was wrapped up in the biggest religio-political debates of his day. This lecture will focus on Murillo as a painter of sacred subjects, providing context for the works in the exhibition and giving you a sense of Murillo's artistic production beyond what we can see in the galleries this autumn. We will begin by digging a little more deeply into the cultural climate of Murillo's Seville. Then we will focus on what was his bread and butter, his large-scale devotional series, and the networks of patronage that made these works possible. We will finish with my favorite by discussing the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. What I hope you will take away from this talk is that Murillo's genre painting, brought to the fore in the Kimball's galleries, is not necessarily separate from the context of his religious art. Rather, the two are intimately tied together. In short, Murillo, who was a skilled draftsman and colorist, painter of striking self-portraits and the provocative genre scenes we see in this exhibition, is not a brilliant artist in spite of his sweetly serene virgins and other poignant religious compositions. Rather, taken with their full context, these works are further evidence of his skill and practice as a thinking artist embedded in the culture of his time. So, let's turn to Seville. Together, let's just pretend we're traveling across the Atlantic, and then we go here and up this river, the Guadalquivir, to Seville, which is the Andalusian capital. Murillo's career and artistic output are both inseparable from the history of his native city. He is documented leaving the region only once during his lifetime for a brief sojourn in Madrid, and he became the city's premier painter in his day. It is no exaggeration to say that you cannot understand Murillo without understanding Seville. By the time Murillo was born, the city was entering a difficult period marked by decades of crisis. Situated on the Guadalquivir, as I mentioned, whose navigability made Seville the port of call for the Spanish World Empire, Seville had grown prosperous, and just to give you an idea, over 17,000 tons of silver passed through Seville between 1503 and 1660. It also had grown populous, with a peak population in 1600 of about 150,000. And I know that doesn't seem, that's like what, Tyler, Texas or something, right? It doesn't seem like much to us, but let's compare that with Madrid at 65,000 or Rome at 80,000. It was the third largest city in Europe in the period, second only to Paris and Naples. The legend on this print, which is from this period, "Quien no ha visto Sevilla no ha visto maravilla," he who hasn't seen Seville hasn't seen what's marvelous. If it's a bit boastful, it does reflect the city's standing as a place of unique wonder in this period. It was a hub for international commerce with the resulting cosmopolitan culture one might expect of such a place. But this golden age was not to last. It is true that the turn of the century brought lean times to Spain at large, which was hit hard by decline under the last of the Habsburgs, with an ever-shrinking empire, an alarmingly diminishing treasury, and a series of interminable foreign wars. However, Seville had its own particular troubles. diminishing returns from the American mines, shipments lost to pirates and storms, and the devastating silting of the Guadalquivir River had put into jeopardy the bustling trade with the Americas that had lined the city's pockets so handsomely from the 16th century on. The silting of the river was especially grim, and essentially this meant that I told you the ships would come up laden with the silver from the Americas, go up the river, and then stop in Seville to unload, and that's where the customs house and everything was. But because of shipwrecks and silt building up in the river over time, those big ships' bottoms would scrape and couldn't make it up the river anymore, so they had to unload and transfer their cargo to smaller ships. This was an environmental disaster that would secure the end of this economic golden age in Seville, with the death blow being dealt in 1680 when the crown moved the official port of trade to Cadiz, which is right here, the nemesis city of Seville, which ended their monopoly on New World trade that they had held for over a century. Beyond economic woes, the city was experiencing severe natural disasters and population decline. And here's just a view of the city from the period to set the tone. A major flood hit Seville in 1626, destroying thousands of houses in addition to crops. A devastating plague swept through in 1649, just as Murillo's career was hitting its stride, and that drastically culled the population over the course of 4 horrific months. The situation was so dire that the doors of the cathedral were ordered to be closed against the overwhelming stench of corpses in the street. And this is, of course, something that sounded like it was from the history books until about 2 years ago. And now moments in history like this hit us a little bit differently, don't they? This plague was shortly followed by famine. Popular uprisings of the battered populace fueled by poverty and hunger marked the early 1650s, and by 1660, Seville's declining fate was sealed. Continued famine and natural disasters such as the 1680 earthquake that shook the bell tower of the cathedral, quote unquote, like a cypress beaten in the wind, could not but be interpreted by the pious civilians as a sign of divine disfavor. We will return to these themes again over the course of the lecture, as they left an indelible mark both on the city and on the artist. The city and its inhabitants really just could not catch a break during this period. Nevertheless, this same difficult period witnessed the flourishing of the arts in Seville. And indeed, the decades after the plague coincided with the best years of Murillo's career. The city, though it had fallen on hard times, still boasted immense wealth among the mercantile and ecclesiastical elite, many of whom were the patrons that we see supporting Murillo in this exhibition and portrayed by him in portraiture. And I've brought just one example that's upstairs and on loan from London, as well as an image of the gallery showing the portraiture section of the exhibition. A powerful church hierarchy coupled with a devout population created the perfect environment for a vibrant artistic scene, particularly when it comes to religious art, at which Murillo excelled. Furthermore, the devout populace of Seville, which looked upon the continual crises of plague, famine, and natural disasters as signs of divine punishment, and honestly, who can blame them? Thought that looking to divine aid and courting divine favor through promoting religious institutions was the answer to turn their luck around. I should also note that historian Amanda Wonder, in a recent book, noted that funding the arts was also a job creator for a depressed economy. From the mid-17th century on, Murillo became the most popular painter of his generation in Seville by any estimation. He dominated the local market for commissions, particularly ecclesiastical commissions, but also among the civilian secular elite. While the river silted and the plague devastated and the economy dried up, the city kept on fighting back. A series of important construction initiatives were undertaken, transforming Seville into a truly Baroque city. Over 30 different ecclesiastical construction projects were completed from the 1660s through the first decades of the next century. These campaigns served to replace damaged structures, but also to revitalize the economy, generating a need for skilled labor and to bolster the spirits of the Sevillanos. As you might imagine, all of this new ecclesiastical and charitable construction meant lots of buildings in need of decorations. And Murillo's work fit the bill precisely, with its famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, sweet style and frequently poignant appeal to pathos, designed to spark reflection and devotion in the viewer. A good example of his early work, executed before the plague, is San Diego de Alcalá and the Poor from about 45 to 46, which appears upstairs in the exhibition. When we see it in the gallery, we are prone to forgetting that paintings like this formed part of a series of works. And in this case, it was a series of 11 works for the small cloister of the seat of the Franciscans in Seville. This monastery is now destroyed, but we can see what it would have looked like installed in situ in this reconstruction. And you can see that the painting that we're discussing appears second from the right. This painting and the others from the series show more of a debt to other Sevillian artists, like Zurbarán, for example, and have not quite so much to do with Murillo's later technique. And we see this very idea is also noted by Spanish painter and art historian Antonio Palomino in the following century, speaking a few decades after Murillo was around. And you'll want to remember this guy because we'll see him again. And he said that one can observe a strength in the chiaroscuro so different from what he, Murillo, did later that if it were not so well known that it was his, hardly anyone would recognize it as such. He did it all after nature, preserving still the concepts of what he had seen and studied. And I think he's absolutely right. When you look at the late work by Murillo and then you look at some of these early pictures, it almost seems like it's done by a different artist. Nevertheless, in works such as this one, we see Murillo already grappling with compositional as well as representational challenges right as his career is hitting its stride, such as how to merge heavenly and earthly realms in the same composition, how to portray the miraculous, or how to approach genre figures. Pictures like this bridge the gap between the sacred and secular in Murillo's work. Notice the closely observed detail. The faces look like they're plucked from the city's streets, down to the dirty feet that we will see Murillo master so thoroughly later in his career. And I think once I've mentioned that, now you're not going to be able to walk through those galleries without noticing how many dirty shoes and feet appear in the paintings in the exhibition. Yes, this is an image of a saint, but it is also an image of Seville. Around a decade later, and a few years after the terrible plague, Murillo's popularity with the local elite, particularly the ecclesiastical elite, was growing. He would have to compete for a few more years with fellow Sevillian painter Francisco de Herrera the Younger, but Murillo was well on his way at this point towards becoming the go-to painter in Seville. His most prestigious commission in this period remains in situ at the Cathedral of Seville. And there is the famous bell tower that I mentioned in the earthquake a few decades later was shaking like a cypress in the wind. There, where the eyes of the entire city could see it, this monumental painting would cement his public reputation. In his vision of St. Anthony of Padua, the heavenly and the earthly come together, combining Murillo's signature attention to finely observe detail, and notice he's got a still life on the table at lower left, with the riotous heavenly vision above, complete with a chorus of angels positioned in all sorts of acrobatic poses, encircling the visionary Christ child. Here is what it looks like today in the chapel to give you a sense of scale. This thing is massive. Not only does this picture mark a turning point in the artist's career, but it also gives you a sense of the Murillo craze of later centuries to which I have already alluded. During the Peninsular Wars, the wily canons of the cathedral were able to negotiate with the invading forces so that they didn't march off with this very important painting, although, to be fair, I don't think it would have been terribly easy to get this thing out of the cathedral and carried across the Pyrenees. But it was not entirely safe, as in 1874, a thief cut out the figure of St. Anthony from the canvas and tried to sell it to a dealer in New York. Thankfully, it was able to be restored, but this gives you a sense of the kind of demand for works by Murillo that would make people think that it was worth it to hack out a painting in the middle of a cathedral. 2 years later, after painting this, Murillo left Seville for the first and only time, traveling to Madrid for a few months on a brief but impactful visit. There he would have met with fellow Sevillian superstar painters like Velázquez, Zurbarán, and Cano, but more importantly, he would have been exposed to the exhaustive Spanish royal collection, and in particular to the work of Titian and Rubens, whose influence would be fundamental for the rest of his career. Velázquez, that I just mentioned, had just finished his masterpiece Las Meninas, and its background, we're always concerned about the concepts of representation when we talk about this painting, but just on a practical perspective, the background shows you a small hint of the types of fabulous collection of art that would have been available to painters who had access to the early modern Spanish court. And again, remember our friend Palomino. He sums up the type of access and artistic education that would have been available during Murillo's visit to Madrid. And he says, "The fact is that foreigners do not want to grant the laurels of fame to any Spaniard unless he has passed through the custom house of Italy." He's thinking, of course, he's alluding to Velázquez, who spent two long trips to Italy, as well as artists like Ribera, who spent most of their career in Italy. But this is without realizing that Italy has come to Spain in its statues, eminent paintings, prints, and books, and that the study of the model with these antecedents abounds everywhere. That is to say that Murillo didn't have to go to Italy to hone his style. Italy came to him in Spain. His art was able to mature and develop to excellence in the peninsula. And indeed, we can see a radical shift in his style after this visit to Madrid. By 1660, we're looking at works like this, The Birth of the Virgin at the Louvre. Gone are the hard lines of his earlier work, and we can see that he was very much impacted by his visit to Madrid. Note the looser, sketchier, more confident brushwork and the lightened palette. His new style by this point is in full swing. And he absolutely excelled at this kind of large-scale devotional painting, especially series of paintings, which also often put his skill on full display to the city. Just to give you an example, the Jacob picture from the Meadows Museum, which was recently treated here at the Kimball, formed part of a larger series and was actually displayed on the facade of this palace during festivities surrounding the opening of a recently renovated parish church called Santa Maria la Blanca, and there's not time to get into that today, but just so you know, Murillo, of course, he's the most in-demand guy in town at this point, and he was responsible for the decorative program of this little jewel box of a church. So I highly encourage you to look that up or even go for a visit. It doesn't get much more high visibility, though, than installing this series of massive paintings on the outside of this palace facade. Murillo was brilliant at this type of serial commission, in which came together the need to spark devotion as well as the need to reflect the cultural values of mid to late 17th century Seville, particularly the approach to charity. Indeed, among his most famous and brilliant religious works are those done for charitable foundations. I'm thinking of there's a home for retired priests that we'll return to in a few minutes, but especially of the Hospital Church of Holy Charity, Santa Caridad, which was run by a brotherhood whose commitment to charity was redoubled after the devastating plague of 1649. Everyone who was anyone in Seville was a member of this brotherhood, and indeed Murillo himself became a member after, of course, a 5-year stint on the wait list. And they probably let him in at that point because they figured they wanted him to paint some works for their new renovated building, which he indeed did 2 years later. All of this, of course, we must continually remember, was in the context of a city in decline, with an ever-increasing population of the hungry and destitute in need of charity. In the series of 8 large and extra-large paintings he did for this chapel at La Caridad, Murillo highlights charity as the path to salvation with technical brilliance, so much so that all but the paintings that were simply too big to cart off were taken by the French in 1810. And I've highlighted in red for you the pictures that were taken and have been replaced by copies. These are copies that you'll see today. And then these, it's hard to tell since we're at the back of the chapel in this view, but these things are humongous and yeah, would have just been impossible to remove, as well as these two altarpieces. So here you have the 8 works that he did for the Santa Caridad. For the series, and I'm just showing you the ones that were taken, and you can see why they're absolutely stunning, Murillo chose to embody each of the 6 acts of mercy or charity instituted by Christ within the context of a biblical narrative, which was quite the masterstroke. And for those of you who are counting, the 7th act of mercy, by the way, was left to a sculpture on the high altar, so it wasn't done by Murillo. But by choosing, with the direction of his patron, of course, biblical passages to illustrate these scenes, Murillo is inviting the viewer to meditate on the charitable act, but also to explore the many layers of rich thematic potential offered by choosing, greatest hits of biblical history, of New Testament and Old Testament history. What made Murillo so successful, and how did he do it? Let's take a closer look at one of these paintings that was recently in our own area, The Prodigal Son from the National Gallery in Washington, which visited Dallas this spring. As in the 4 other spoliated pictures, we see exquisite brushwork, the glory of Murillo's mature technique. You'll notice that the brushwork is sketchy, but that each loose stroke is precisely applied. This is the type of handling that would have put him on the pedestal with Van Dyck and Titian in the 19th century. His signature and lustrous facility with whites, it's not so easy to slap white on a canvas and give it so much dimension, is particularly appreciable in this picture. And the act of mercy that's being illustrated here is clothing the naked. So the father bringing out the rich garments to clothe his wayward but returned son is illustrating that act of mercy. Here, Murillo is showing off his ability to arrange a fluid composition, to imbue his works with smooth coloration and compositional lyricism that made his paintings so prized in subsequent centuries. But he is also exploring his mastery of the Baroque dramatic potential of the well-chosen moment. You see that the picture is rather theatrical in its arrangement. There is freedom and movement, but above all, there is harmony, displaying Murillo's knack for taking even the most dramatic of moments and somehow imbuing them with tranquility. These paintings show an intimate familiarity with works that he must have encountered while in Madrid. In my opinion, most obvious is his relationship to Velázquez's large Joseph's coat, Joseph's tunic picture. And you'll see there's compositional similarities between the father in both pictures, right? The little dog, and even the presentation of the garments. In Velázquez's picture, you'll notice that the dog is not happy. He is not convinced by the lying brothers of Joseph, who claim that this bloodied tunic is evidence of their brother's death. Even if the father, and you can see he's just absolutely grief-stricken, even if he falls for the trick, nature cannot be fooled. The dog knows what they did. The same device of the skeptical dog is in Murillo's picture transformed into a sentimental display of unconditional love. The dog recognizes the master. It's like his master's voice, those old ads, or even like in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes back, the only one who recognizes him is the dog. It's the same idea here. The tunic here, the clothing, which in Velázquez's picture is falsified evidence and really grim commentary on sibling relationships, is used in Murillo's picture to represent the act of charity, of clothing the naked. This is the type of moralizing and yet tender scene at which Murillo excelled. Thinking about pictures like this one help us to complicate our understanding of what we see in the Kimball exhibition when we look at works like this, like St. Thomas of Villanueva distributing alms. With its tender and empathetic, if highly romanticized, narrative. This painting depicts both a saintly boy, here, distributing his clothes to the poor, but also a group of real boys, poor boys whom we might even call urchins. There's more than local color on display here. Rather, what we're looking at is a recurrent theme in Murillo's work that direct physical contact with the poor and the exercise of charity were key to salvation. Indeed, in the Caridad series that we just saw, we saw Murillo approaching charity in a serene and lyrical way. And it is important to note that members of this Brotherhood of Charity, including Murillo himself, were expected to have a direct, intimate, and very physical relationship with the poor. Many sermons at the time preached that the poor existed for the salvation of the rich, so that they could have an outlet for their charity. Such scenes of the devout and grateful poor interacting with the charitable rich show an idealized vision of poverty, obviously, make no mistake here. This is not intended to be social realism, and it's painted with an agenda. But there's sympathy and poignancy. Compare such a painting, then, to a seemingly secular work like the Dulwich Three Boys currently installed, upstairs in the same gallery, with its more sinister analysis of virtue or lack thereof. In it, the two seated boys here, and by the way, a contemporary viewer would have instantly understood looking at this picture that those boys did not get that pie by any honest means. They refused to share their ill-gotten gains with the water jug-carrying boy passing by. What exactly is the message here about charity, poverty, or the nature of children? It's very interesting to compare these two. And in this context, I find it interesting to consider that some of the very same elite patrons who would have collected Murillo's work during his lifetime were also the very noblemen responsible for putting down the bread riots that followed the plague and famine, as you will recall, in which the desperately hungry took up arms to search the city for grain. A contemporary account describes the rioters as rogues, all of them, and vile people, and these epithets could easily be used to describe some of the genre figures that we see in the walls in the gallery. The nobility organized to quash the rebellion, executing the leaders of the riot and displaying their heads on pikes in the public square. Despite the at times idealized vision of rich and poor offered to us by Murillo in works like the one at left, the reality is that Seville was a place of fragile social structure, divided among tense class lines and with class antagonism. The difficult conditions of famine, inflation, and plague only made differences between rich and poor more painful. Murillo, as an artist, was very aware of the delicate balance that had to be struck in these depictions and of their different circumstances of display and commission. You'd paint one type of picture to be put in a church and another to be acquired by a private patron, for example. He thought them through and planned them carefully. For example, in the Dulwich picture of the three boys, we know that he changed the facial expression of this figure from a teeth-baring sneer to more of a smirk. He also moved his hand, which originally slapped the black boy's hand out of the way of the pie. And with these tweaks, instead of presenting a meditation on the meanness of poverty, the painting becomes more of a playful portrayal of boyhood, though still there's something sinister, considering that Seville had the largest slave population and the largest slave market in Spain at the time. Works like this invite us to ask ourselves what kind of commentary the artist was making and inviting us to contemplate about the nature of charity or the obligations of viewers with means in a society in crisis. I hope you see here that the secular and the sacred cannot be separated when thinking about Murillo's work. They are two sides to the same coin. This is, of course, reflected in the exhibition's title, Murillo from Heaven to Earth, as well as in the layout of the galleries, in which the secular and sacred are not separate, but in fact coexist together. To review our journey to date, Murillo was the most in-demand religious painter in Seville by the mid-17th century, winning all of its major commissions. He was the master of gracefully engaging compositions and emotional appeal to the viewer. We saw that he never left Seville during his lifetime, with the exception of a brief trip to Madrid in 1658 when he was 40 years old. After this exposure to Velázquez and the Spanish Royal Collection, which was rich in Italian painting, he perfected his style with his signature fluid brushwork, hazy execution, and luminous approach to color. It is this skill with a brush and immersion in the theopolitical climate of 17th century Seville that brings us to our final and perhaps our most triumphant topic, Murillo and the Immaculate Conception. Our final topic to cover will demonstrate that Murillo's art did not only reflect the values and climate of devotional fervor of his city, but in fact helped to create that climate, actively contributing to the advancement of a religio-political agenda. As a young artist, and then again as a seasoned painter, he participated in the two biggest religious controversies of his day: the canonization campaign of St. Ferdinand, which we won't discuss tonight because Professor Adam Jasinski will be giving what I'm sure will be a brilliant lecture on this in January, as well as the campaign for dogmatic definition of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. Though none of Murillo's versions, I know it's hard to say version and virgin so many times in one lecture, but they both kind of work here. Though none of these versions of the Immaculate Conception appear in this exhibition, you need only hop on I-30 and head eastbound to the Meadows Museum in Dallas to see one in person, and that's the example that I've put up here on the screen for you. Seville was, in fact, the epicenter of the renewed push for dogmatic definition of the Immaculate Conception, a belief with medieval foundations that became hotly contested in the 17th century. Examining Murillo's involvement in this fevered effort, always, of course, you're going to get sick of hearing this, but remembering that we are in the context of a once great city in decline, will give us the opportunity to explore the texture of religious life in Golden Age Seville, which was full of pageantry, festival, as well as controversy. But it will also let us take seriously the persuasive potential of images and the very great power that images and those who made them could wield. Images took on a protagonistic role in the Immaculate controversy, which gained important but incomplete victories for Seville during Murillo's lifetime, boosting morale in a city that had fallen on hard times. Even today, Seville has not forgotten its loyalty to the belief in Mary's sinless conception. There's even an 80s rock ballad that I did not bother to bring today, but there's an 80s rock ballad by a Sevillian band that brags about the fact that Seville supported the Immaculate Conception before Rome. So come up after if you would like a link to that. But I do have an illustration of this, that every year after midnight on the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, groups of students from various academic departments from the University of Seville gather to sing what are known as tunas at the Immaculate Monument just outside the cathedral. The monument around which they gather was erected in 1917 in memory of the city's defense of the contested doctrine, which, despite the city's and subsequently the Spanish monarchy's best efforts, was actually not defined as dogma until 1854. This triumphal monument celebrates those local heroes who fought most valiantly to defend the Virgin. So who did they pick? I bet you can guess. Among the four chosen are a theologian and a poet, but more importantly for us, a sculptor, and of course, our friend, the painter, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. What does this tell us? This tells us two things. That first, the triumph was ultimately just as much a victory for artists as it was for theologians, but also that of all the city's innumerable painters who contributed images of the Immaculate Conception to the cause, that Murillo was remembered through the centuries as the most important one. Admittedly, stirring up your interest in these images might take some doing, but I'll do my best. These images are often taken for granted, and I'm showing you three examples that are held at the Meadows Museum. The one in the center is, of course, by Murillo, and the one on the right is actually by our friend Palomino, the one whose quotes we keep seeing on the screen. They're thought to be pretty but uncomplicated manifestations of counter-Reformation Marian fervor in Spain, but they are much more complex, as we will see. Before we go any further, though, what is the Immaculate Conception? I'm getting ahead of myself. without defining that. This is something that a lot of people get wrong. It is not the incarnation. And for a very famous example of an image representing the incarnation, I'm showing you the Murillo altarpiece. Usually the incarnation is represented by an annunciation scene where Mary becomes pregnant but remains a virgin. And in this picture, it's brilliantly done with the little baby Jesus coming through the window, and you see the light passes through the glass but does not break it, which is like this symbol of, unbroken virginity of Mary. But oddly enough, I hope you'll humor me and let cable news explain the Immaculate Conception to you. Before I play this clip, I just want a quick disclaimer that both of the guys you're about to see have done an awful lot since the first time I used this clip in 2018, but I hope you will excuse my bringing them into the room because I think it's too good to miss.
What do you mean by the Immaculate Conception?
That was the substance of... Look, I was making a point that this is an absurd coincidence.
By what? Like, what do you think happened with the Immaculate Conception?
The Immaculate Conception, it's obviously a religious doctrine that deals with the Christian faith.
I know, but I'm saying, like, where is the analogy? That's what I don't understand. What do you think happened with the Immaculate Conception?
Look, did you really bring me on to discuss my religious views, Chris?
No, I'm saying you made the analogy, and I just...
Jesus was born.
I don't understand. The Immaculate Conception is not how Jesus was born.
It was the conception. That's the nature of the Immaculate Conception.
It was Mary's conception. It was the mother's conception without original sin. It was not the conception of Jesus. Facts matter.
Okay, I'm glad you enjoyed that. I was really not sure whether that would necessarily be fun because, we're just having fun with Murillo, not getting into CNN. But now that thanks to CNN, we all know what the Immaculate Conception is, that it's about Mary being conceived without the stain of original sin, which is the sin of Adam and Eve. From the first instance of her conception, we move to the challenge that this posed to artists trying to support the doctrine. How exactly can you portray a conception, much less a stainless one? Without getting too bogged down in the details and at the risk of oversimplifying, Golden Age Spanish artists settled on a relatively simple solution for a very complex and esoteric theological argument, borrowing from other Marian iconographies and settling on the image with which we are now all familiar. The choice for this simple image, right, it's a conception. If she's being conceived, why does she look like she's 15? Just work with us here. This was actually a brilliant PR move on the part of the Immaculists. We don't have time to get into it too much, but the debate over the Immaculate Conception became essentially a war in the streets. I'm not exaggerating. People threatened to blow up other people's houses over this. And it came to a head in 1615 in Seville, which is just 3 years before Murillo was born. To give you the Cliff's Notes version, the main opponents were Dominicans and the main proponents were the Franciscans and the Jesuits. Basically, think of the turmoil of 21st century politics with both sides fiercely defending their own cause, completely unwilling to hear the perspective of the other side, but about a really, really obscure religious doctrine. What's important for us as people interested in art history is that images became the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of the belief's proponents. They flooded the streets and churches, public buildings with multimedia propaganda campaign and using images like these, whether in a large-scale painting or printed or on a small medallion, and that sort of thing. Those who were against the belief had no image to respond with, only sermons. And what the Immaculists understood was that the general population would be swayed much more convincingly by an image campaign than by long-winded sermons and published tracts. To give you a sense of the tradition that Murillo was drawing on, here I'm showing you two examples by Francisco Pacheco, who is a Sevillian painter and art theorist of 2 generations before, and these are from the 1610s and 20s. The iconographic formula of the Virgin on the crescent moon with her hands clasped and stars at her head and the moon at her feet had been well solidified by the time Murillo was born. And some of you might recognize that the Immaculate Conception's iconography draws from scriptural sources, primarily Revelation 12, the woman of the apocalypse, and you can read the quote from Revelation here. And it is enriched by Marian symbols that allude to her sinless conception, usually down below, things like the enclosed garden or a spotless mirror. But Murillo did it best. Why is that? It is a matter of both technique, his late, exquisite, vaporous style that everybody loves to hate, or loves to love, in my case, was particularly suited to portraying a heavenly scene. But also, it's a question of simplicity. In most of his pictures of the Immaculate Conception, Murillo chose to get rid of all the extraneous detail. You can compare, Pacheco's picture has so much going on, and it's kind of almost distracting. And Murillo strips the image down to its essence. He's quite the visual rhetorician. Unlike Pacheco and others before and after Pacheco, Murillo understood that arguing for the Immaculate Conception in an image wasn't about explaining the doctrine. It was about making the image so iconic and ubiquitous that it became its own argument, and so emotionally appealing to the viewer that belief in the doctrine became a gut feeling. Murillo, after all, as we've seen, is a master of the emotional appeal. So when you look at images like this, you're like, yeah, you were right, it's the Immaculate Conception, I'm on board. Murillo painted so many Immaculate Conceptions, dozens, in fact, and I've just put a couple of examples on the screen. He painted more than any other painter, and he's even remembered for this in the 19th century in romantic paintings like this, and we have Murillo showing off one of his earliest Immaculate Conceptions. In short, when you think of the Immaculate Conception in Spanish art, you think of Murillo. We need an entire lecture series to cover them all, so we're only going to talk about the most important one, known as the Immaculate Conception of Los Venerables, also known as the Sult Madonna. This is Murillo's most famous version. It was painted for Justino de Neve, whose portrait I showed you earlier, and is upstairs. And eventually it ended up installed in the charitable foundation of the Hospital for Retired Priests, of which de Neve was patron. This was his most important commission of the final 2 decades of his career. In it, we see a shimmering, incandescent Virgin. She is surrounded by an absolute riot of putti, little angels, and at her feet is a perfectly placed, jaunty moon. She is clothed in completely diaphanous drapery. Again, note his skill with shades of white. And her mantle is the most vivid blue imaginable, while the background is hazy gold evaporating into cloud. The image creates the sensation of rapid ascension. Swirling angels move the Virgin upward, and it's almost like an ascension of the Virgin. This picture is not only the most famous painting by the most acclaimed Spanish painter of the latter half of the 17th century. It is also a record of the power of images as a tool of persuasion, the ultimate triumph of the most successful visual campaign of the 17th century, the campaign for the Immaculate Conception. The flood of images of the Virgin's sinless conception led to a surge in popular support for the devotion and put continual pressure on the Vatican, helping pave the way for that dogmatic definition that eventually came 2 centuries later. So no mere record of straightforward piety or of craze toward the Virgin. This kind of picture is an artistic, persuasive, one might even say propagandistic triumph. What happened to this famous picture next will provide you both with a sense of the place of this image and the artist in the larger picture of Spanish art history, and we will spend our last few moments tracing its curious afterlife. The spectacular Venerables Immaculate Conception was not long installed in its chapel in Seville before, like so many others, it ended up being carted off in the early 19th century as part of the cache of pictures looted during the Peninsular War by Napoleonic commander Marshal Soult. And that's this guy. After making its way to France, Murillo's Immaculate Conception ended up in the collection of the Musée du Louvre, after the institution acquired it at auction in 1852 for the staggering and unprecedented price of 615,000 francs, which at that point was the highest price ever paid for a work of art. See if you can spot our friend, the Immaculate Conception of Los Venerables, here on this extremely crowded right-hand wall. Popularly known thereafter as the Souled Madonna in memory of its French captor, the picture rose to international celebrity at the Louvre. There, it was by far the most popular painting among copyists in the 19th century, receiving no fewer than 167 recorded copy requests over a period of only 5 years. And this is documented in works like Louis Béroud's painting of a woman artist copying after Murillo. It remained at the Louvre for almost a century, until, that is, a Spanish delegation made up of a bureaucrat, a museum director, and an artist arrived at the museum in October 1940 in the heart of Nazi-occupied Paris. They met with Jacques Jaujard, who was the newly appointed director of the Musées Nationaux, to propose a diplomatic initiative between the Spanish fascist Franco dictatorship and the collaborationist French Vichy regime. Their goal was to breach the sensitive subject of the repatriation of key Spanish cultural items then in France. And at the top of their wish list of 4 objects that were considered to be essentially Spanish was none other than Murillo's Immaculate Conception. Though its fame had fallen somewhat with the changing tastes of the 20th century, given that this picture had been acquired for a king's ransom and was one of the Louvre's most popular pictures for nearly 100 years, its return was certainly no small request. Records of the proposal leave no doubt that the return of the Immaculate Conception was the Spanish delegation's top priority, chosen by the Spanish embassy for its status as one of the jewels of the Louvre's collection. And we have Jaujard's internal memo, which records the gist of that October meeting, and listing Murillo as the first request, establishing the Spanish delegation's exigency for its return. And this is what he wrote: "The Murillo represents the most perfect image of the patroness of Spain. In order to estimate the depth of popular sentiment attached to this work by Murillo, it suffices to say that if the proposed exchange is achieved, the return of the Immaculate Conception to Spain would be the object of spectacular ceremonies that, in order to have all their character and all of their impact, should take place on December 8th, the date of the feast of the Immaculate Conception." This memo reveals the rhetoric of the Spanish appeal. Murillo's image was the most perfect iteration of a national icon, and upon its return would be welcomed back with joyous celebrations. It also established a pretty tight timeline for the image's return. For maximum propagandistic value, Murillo's monumental canvas needed to be back on Spanish soil by the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on December 8th. That is, in less than 2 months. This haste meant that the actual terms of the agreement between the French and Spanish, which would ultimately result in a reciprocal exchange of paintings, had not yet been settled before the Murillo was returned. This flourish of generosity was more than a goodwill gesture to make up for the cultural sins of the previous century, but was in fact a strategic preamble to court Franco's possible entry into the Second World War as a Nazi ally. So like, we'll give you back your painting, but maybe you're gonna help us out in a few months. So on December 6th, 1940, Murillo's most iconic work made its second journey over the Pyrenees. Transporting such a large canvas across war-ravaged France and into fascist Spain, which was just beginning to recover from its own civil war, was no small feat. The crated painting here traveled from Paris by train, and it was held up 35 kilometers, quite dramatically, from the border due to washed out tracks. And they loaded it on a military convoy truck and limped across the border in that. It arrived right in the nick of time on the very morning of the Immaculate Feast to the Mediodía station in Madrid, and we see that here. There, it was celebrated with all the pomp of a royal entry. High-level diplomats from both France and Spain met it at the station before it was officially unveiled at the French embassy, later being installed in its permanent home at the Prado Museum. Its momentous arrival made the cover of the December 10th edition of the ABC Madrid newspaper, which we see here, and its return was beautifully manipulated into a propagandistic triumph for Franco's government. The fundamental version of the ultimate Spanish image by one of the ultimate Spanish artists had at last returned to Spanish soil. The repatriation of Murillo's Immaculate Conception of Los Venerables is more than a curious sidebar in the afterlife of Murillo's most famous painting. For me, and I hope now for you, it yet again demonstrates the enduring legacy of the phenomenon that we have traced across this lecture, the absolute inseparability of secular and sacred in Murillo's paintings, sometimes enduring long after the paint had dried. Thank you.